Yeah, so they were doing a shorts program at the time called Cartoon Institute, and that's where Regular Show, Uncle Grandpa, I think one or two others were sort of like part of this as shorts. And because I'd done an internship, I knew some of the people, and they announced it. And one of my buddies who was still there was like, "Hey, we should go and pitch our own thing," and we did. And yeah, we got to make a short. It's called The Awesome Chronicles of Manny and Calm. There was a lot of really talented people on it in that program as part of that program. So that was a great opportunity to just be able to like learn from other people and see how everybody worked and see other shorts going through the process and the pipeline and everything. And that pilot is actually what helped me get hired at DreamWorks. I'd done an internship at DreamWorks, and then I knew that they were hiring storyboard artists for their branch that was up north called PDI at the time. Which has now since been shut down, and they were having a really hard time getting board artists to move up because most of the board artists, like from LA, had kids and houses, and then they were already sort of settled in LA. And I had a story up there, the pilot that I did at Cartoon Network, and that's what ended up getting me hired. I was at PDI for 3 years at DreamWorks. It was my first feature job. And the reality was like, I knew I could be funny and I loved cartoons, but I didn't know cinematography. I didn't know film language. I didn't know long form storytelling like movies. My dream was never to work on features. I loved things like Ren and Stimpy and Spongebob and, and Cartoon Network Nickelodeon I grew up on. That's always what I thought I was going to do. And when I ended up getting the job at DreamWorks, I just kind of fell in love with sort of long form storytelling and the puzzle that is and the challenge that is and the iterating you do. And so I just have ended up staying in feature for most of my career, which I never really planned. And then the older you get, the more you realize, TV's for the young. But the main difference, at least historically, is in TV, you'll and series, which Steven's probably talked about, you'll kind of just throw out a bunch of stuff as fast as you can. You don't really do anything twice. You just kind of do a bunch of stuff, put it out there, and then see kind of what worked at the end. And then if you get a second season, you just try to capitalize on that stuff. And that's why I think historically a lot of those shows, SpongeBob, Ren and Stimpy, any of those Dexter's Lab, Powerpuff Girls, the second and third season are the ones that are really like always the best ones. And it's not because they were bad early on, it's just they were figuring out what was working. But you put the stuff out really fast. In feature, you'll work on the same project for 2 or 3 years before anybody ever sees it. And you iterate and you iterate and you iterate and you iterate to the point where what you started with is nothing like what it ends up as. And so that's the trade-off. In TV, you can just get stuff out fast, but there might be a discrepancy in the quality of it. And in feature, you just take a longer time to put something out and you just hope it's good because you don't really normally get another chance unless it's a big hit and then you can make a sequel. DreamWorks was for me where I felt like I had to learn all the stuff. I had to get better drawing. I had to learn how to cut. I had to learn long form storytelling, all this kind of stuff. I'd been there 3 years and my contract was up and I never thought I was going to leave. And they basically made me a kind of a low ball offer. And they're like, well, you're the new guy. And I'm thinking like, I've been here 3 years. But the reality was there were people that had been there 12, 15, probably maybe even close to 20 years at that time. And so Blue Sky, I met them at this convention, CTN, if you guys have ever been there. They were looking for specifically comedy people to come and help on this movie Epic. The difference was DreamWorks was like, you're the new guy. You just started. Blue Sky looked at me and they were like, 3 years at DreamWorks, please, like come help us. And they didn't know. I was still learning. I was still figuring it out. But that's sort of like a lesson I learned early in my career is just, you go somewhere and you do good work and that'll speak for itself at the end of the day. But yeah, so I went to Blue Sky and the difference in how they saw me, I think also gave me more confidence. They saw me as someone who could help. And I think that coupled with the work I had done at DreamWorks in terms of getting my skills up to par, learning, kind of all came together at Blue Sky. And I say this all the time, I think it took me about 2.5 to 3 years to feel like I was competent. And then about another 2 years to feel like I was actually good. But it takes a while. So, I always tell younger artists, like, don't get discouraged. This stuff never happens overnight. And when you're doing stuff like this, that's a skill. It's just time. You just have to put the hours in. There's no shortcuts.
What happened after Blue Sky? You were there 3 years and then, because then stuff gets like a little crazy. You'll start like co-directing and doing other stuff.
Yeah, I bounced around a bit. So I had worked for 2 major studios, DreamWorks and Cartoon Network, and then DreamWorks and Blue Sky, and a little bit of Cartoon Network, but 2 major feature studios. And I came back to LA, and after having done that for 6 years, in animation is so small that you do sort of make a name for yourself if you're doing good stuff. Because the industry's so small, everybody knows everybody. When you're, a team player, and when you contribute, and when people like working with you, people know that. So after Blue Sky in New York, I came back to LA, and it was the first time for me in my career where people knew who I was. And so I had a few different offers And there was this small team of people doing a movie called Wish Dragon, which ultimately ended up on Netflix, but was kind of through Sony and this Chinese company at the time. And it was a very interesting and appealing opportunity for me because they were the opposite of the big studios. They were just a group of about 10 to 12 people that were making a movie. That was it. China was funding it. They were going to produce it over there, but they needed the designs and the storyboards and the animatics and the editing to be done here. And it was very appealing to me after having worked at the major studios where the movies just go through so many different hands and you do a sequence, but then someone else goes on top, which is how it goes. But then someone else goes on top of it, and then someone else goes on top of it, and then you do one more fix, and then you do a joke, but then someone else does. And at the end, it's really rare that you get a real chunk of the movie that you're like, that's mine. A lot of times it's like, well, that was like my idea. And then that person drew it. And then the writer wrote a different version of it. And then I did that one joke also. But there's very, very rare that you have like an actual chunk of a feature film at a major studio. And The Wish Dragon was sort of the opposite in terms of what it was providing, which was they were a small team, they had zero interference, but they had less time. But that was the trade-off. It's like whoever's helping is going to have your stuff in there because it has to be. And that was just very appealing to me at the time because it was different. And so I ended up signing on to do that. And that was directed by Chris Apollons. The producer was Aaron Warner, and he's the guy who produced Shrek. And the other co-editor is the guy Rad Seacrest, who maybe some of you guys know. And so I actually started as a storyboard artist. I signed on just as a storyboard artist. And it turned out we were so small that it was just basically me and Rad doing most of it. And they said, hey, do you just want to be head of story, like co-head of story? And they just made me co-head of story on the first Wish Dragon. We had sort of a rotating cast of sort of like, other sort of junior storyboard artists, a couple of people, heavy hitters who would come in and help us once in a while. But I think Rad and I probably did the bulk of that. I'd say probably 60 to 70% of the movie ultimately.
Whose idea was it to have the villain always have his hands in his pockets?
It's so weird. Somebody asked me that just the other week. I don't know what it like that. People really stuck with people. The editor on the thing I'm on a dream, she didn't even know I was on Wish Dragon. She just started talking about it. And I was like, oh yeah, I worked on that. She's like, whose idea was the pockets thing? This was actually part of like a bigger conversation I like talking about Wish Dragon. Chris Apollons, who was the director, it was a very simple idea. He had a very simple story and ideas like that he thought were cool and interesting. And then he relied on me and Rad and the other story team to how do we make the most entertaining version of that. And so he really trusted us and just let us go wild. And that's where you get, I think there's a shot where like his foot comes up and he's like, rubbing his face. I think there was ones where he was driving with his feet. The story idea was that Chris wanted him to feel like even with his hands in his pockets, he's very threatening. And then at the end of the movie, he takes his hands out, and you're supposed to be like, oh shit, he just doubled his ability to hurt you. I think it got lost a little bit that was sort of like this kind of bigger idea. But it was an idea.
I loved it. I would love to have that kind of limitation.
Yeah. Well, that's a good note just about animation and story in general is like when you give yourself limits, it forces you to be more creative, put confines on something. And then actually Wish Dragon's a good example of that. There's a scene where the kid's fighting this sort of goons in this alleyway. And he wished that inadvertently, he said, oh, I wish I knew how to fight, not realizing the dragon was going to grant his wish and give him kung fu powers. And I remember when they launched me on it, Chris was like, like we have this whole big playground, what can we do? And I was like, well, I would rather just like have his foot get stuck in a door, and it's like more of a Jackie Chan thing where it's like, and Chris like, well, but then how does it elevate? And I was like, well, I'll show you. And so it was like then he was like opening the door and shutting it, and then the door split in half, and it was like swinging around, and then he was going in and out of the hole. And I was just like that forced us to make something that was more unique than just having him run around this sort of like junkyard with kung fu. And those are the challenges I like. I like when someone's like, you can't make that entertaining. Like, well, no, you haven't taken it as far as you can go. And Jackie Chan movies are really good at that, like the fight scenes. In any animated feature, there's going to be 3 to 4 scenes that you can't write. So the first How to Train Your Dragon, I'm assuming most people probably seen it. The scene where Hiccup's on the beach with Toothless and they bond, right? And they're drawing in the sand and they're playing fetch. You can't write that. You could have a writer try to write out what those things are, but it's not going to mean anything. You have to watch it. The first flight where he flies with Toothless for the first time, you might go back and adjust the dialogue and some of the specificity of what he's saying, but you can't write that scene. It's the feeling, it's the rhythm of the shots, it's the energy of it, the acting of him being nervous. You're never going to get that on a page. And so I think that's a good thing to think about when you approach animated projects is like, what are the aspects of this story that I'm telling that are what make animation special? Because nowadays the lines are obviously blurring between live action and animation, because you can kind of do anything now with the technology, if you have enough budget and the technology. But historically, you know, if you're pitching an animated project, especially in feature, they'll ask you, why does it need to be animated? And it's a valid question. It's a good way to think about things is because then you're already ahead of the game, because you're allowing the medium to sort of drive the storytelling and enhance the storytelling. Yeah, I got a little derailed off the career stuff, but yeah, Wish Dragon
That's
1,
my bad. Yeah.
then Warner Brothers doing development stuff for the feature department, and then was directing Wish Dragon 2 through the pandemic.
Are you having fun on the movie you're on right now?
Yes. Yes. So when I was helping out on these other ones, KF Kung Fu Panda was right at the end, and they brought me on just to do like punch up comedy stuff. That's an easy, well, not easy, but that's a fun job because most of the work's already done, and you're just trying to enhance and just trying to like you're just coming in and you're just like an assassin. You're just like boom, 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 boom. If they like one or two things, that's great. If they don't use anything, it doesn't really matter. On this development project, it's right at the beginning. So I came on right as a bunch of other storyboarders came on, and nothing had been storyboarded. And that's exciting because everything you do, whether you're showing them what's working and what's good about the project, or sometimes you're showing them what's not working, but it's all exciting because every time you're learning new stuff. Like I said, even if that means you're learning like, oh, we thought this character was going to be this way, but it's not working. It's like, cool, good. Like we learned something that's exciting versus being on something like one of the Ice Age films. So many things have been established already that there's not as much like discovery. So you're kind of just doing what you know kind of works versus when you're on something new, an original, you're discovering everything, the shot language, how the cinematography, the tone, what kinds of jokes and gags work, what kinds of jokes and gags don't work, the characters especially, right? Like you're bringing them to life. And so that's been a really fun part of being on this project at this stage, getting on early and helping shape those things.